For years, Europe has told itself a comforting story. That law is enough. That rules restrain power. That geography no longer decides fate. Then came Venezuela, and suddenly an old idea resurfaced in Washington, taking Greenland. Not because it is legal, not because it is moral, but because, in the logic of power politics, it looks possible. When European leaders responded with statements and legal objections, they revealed something deeper than disagreement. They revealed absence. Because in a world that is becoming transactional again, power does not listen to protest. It listens to presence. I want you to pause here and ask yourself, if Greenland truly mattered to Europe's security, would others feel confident even talking about it this way? This is not a story about American aggression. It is a story about a vacuum. If this question matters to you about Europe's future, about how power really works, stay with me. Because to understand Greenland, we first have to understand the mistake Europe keeps repeating. Europe's instinctive response to the Greenland debate follows a familiar pattern. When power intrudes, Europe reaches for law. When pressure rises, Europe declares red lines. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Law defines legitimacy. It does not guarantee control. Greenland is legally secure, politically autonomous, embedded in NATO, protected on paper. Yet none of that answers the strategic question that actually matters in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. Who can shape outcomes on the ground if circumstances change? The Trump administration's worldview is brutally simple. It acts where three conditions align. Control looks feasible, resistance looks manageable, and alternatives appear absent. Venezuela fit that logic. Greenland, in rhetoric at least, begins to resemble it. Not because invasion is realistic, but because deterrence feels ambiguous. Europe keeps arguing about what is not allowed. Power politics asks a different question. What is prevented? This gap between legality and capability is where vulnerability lives. And it is exactly where Greenland now sits. To see how Europe ended up here, we need to rewind not to recent headlines, but to decades of strategic neglect. For most of the post-Cold War era, Greenland existed in Europe's strategic imagination as an afterthought. The Arctic was seen as stable, predictable, governed by rules rather than rivalry. Security planning drifted south, attention shifted to markets, integration, and crises elsewhere. That made sense until it didn't. Power competition never disappears. It pauses, and when it returns, it does so through geography. Greenland's position never changed. What changed was the environment around it. Russia rebuilt its Arctic military posture. China began positioning itself for long-term influence, calling itself a near-Arctic state. Together, they started shaping the Northern Sea route into a shorter, dual-use corridor between Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, Europe treated Greenland less as strategic terrain and more as a political sensitivity, lightly defended, cautiously governed, dependent on others for key capabilities. In power politics, that combination sends a signal regardless of legal status. History shows this pattern clearly. When regions sit at the intersection of emerging competition and weak strategic ownership, pressure follows. Not immediately, but inevitably. And eventually, pressure turns into a test. That test arrived not quietly, but in full view. The moment of rupture didn't arrive with troops or treaties. It arrived with the decision. In June 2025, Washington quietly shifted Greenland from US European Command to Northern Command. Bureaucratic on the surface, strategic beneath it, because commands reveal priorities, and priorities reveal intent. This was not about Denmark. It was not about Europe. It was about US homeland defense. Greenland, in this framing, was no longer a peripheral NATO concern. It was a forward node feeding missile warning, satellite tracking, and early warning systems directly into American security architecture. That single move crystallized what Europe had avoided admitting. Greenland was already being operationalized by others. From Washington's perspective, this made perfect sense. The island sits astride the GIUK Gap, the choke point for submarines entering the Atlantic. It anchors space and satellite infrastructure in an era of counter-space rivalry. And it lies adjacent to an Arctic where Russia is entrenched and China is probing patiently. This was the first real stress test, not of law, of ownership. If you found yourself unsettled by how quietly that shift happened, you're not alone. Because the deeper danger lies beneath the surface, inside the system. Europe built around Greenland without ever fully securing it. What makes Greenland vulnerable is not a single decision. It is a structure. Europe built a system where responsibility is dispersed, presence is limited, and escalation is avoided by design. Denmark carries formal sovereignty. NATO provides an umbrella. The United States supplies the hard capabilities. Everyone assumes someone else will step in if things turn serious. That arrangement works until it doesn't. Because systems like this depend on alignment. The moment interests diverge, leverage shifts. Washington focuses on homeland defense. Moscow expands Arctic militarization. Beijing invests patiently in long-term access and influence. Europe, meanwhile, hesitates, concerned about provocation, cost, and political sensitivity. In strategic terms, Greenland sits inside a paradox. It is essential infrastructure without essential ownership. Vital to space, missile warning, and undersea monitoring, yet only lightly integrated into European force planning. That gap is the opening coercive power looks for. This is how pressure operates in the modern era. Not through invasion, through dependency, through quiet dominance of key nodes, through shaping the facts on the ground until alternatives narrow. Europe's mistake is assuming that restraint reduces risk. In contested systems, restraint without presence does the opposite. And once this logic takes hold, escalation no longer comes from one side alone. It accelerates. The second crisis doesn't announce itself with headlines. It unfolds through accumulation. Russian Arctic forces harden their posture. China deepens cooperation along the Northern Sea route. Dual-use infrastructure blurs civilian and military lines. Each move is incremental. Each is deniable. Together, they change the balance. At the same time, Europe's response remains cautious. Investments are discussed. Capabilities are debated. Timelines stretch. Presence stays thin. And in power politics, time favors the actor willing to move first. This is the danger of slow-motion crises. No single action crosses a red line. But the strategic environment shifts anyway. Control becomes asymmetrical. Options narrow. Deterrence weakens, not because anyone breaks the rules, but because reality evolves faster than policy. From Washington's vantage point, this reinforces a blunt conclusion. If others are shaping Greenland's strategic environment, the United States cannot afford ambiguity. That is how interest turns into fixation, not through greed, but through perceived necessity. This is the second test, not of Europe's intentions, but of its credibility. Because when strategic space fills up without you, someone else decides how it will be used. Now, bring this closer, because strategy is never abstract for the people who live inside it. If you are a European citizen, Greenland may feel distant. Ice, maps, military acronyms. But what happens there shapes the security system that protects you. The satellites guiding communications, the early warning systems buying decision time, the deterrence that keeps pressure from reaching Europe's borders. When that system feels thin, uncertainty travels fast. Allies act unilaterally. Rivals probe harder. And ordinary people absorb the cost through instability, through fear, through the slow erosion of agency over their own future. This is what strategic neglect looks like on the human level. Not drama, drift. Decisions made elsewhere because presence was missing here. You deserve a Europe that does not outsource its security reflexes, one that anticipates pressure instead of reacting to it, one that treats distant territory as connected destiny. If this resonates with you, if you believe security should be built, not assumed, pause for a moment, share this conversation, stay engaged, because awareness is the first step toward resolve. And what happens next will not stop at Europe's edge. What unfolds in Greenland does not stay in Greenland, because the Arctic is no longer a frontier. It is a junction. Control over the GIUK Gap shapes access to the Atlantic. Influence over satellite and space infrastructure affects global communications and military coordination. And the Northern Sea Route redraws the map of trade between Europe and Asia. These are not regional issues. They are system-level levers. As Russia entrenches its Arctic posture and China positions itself as a long-term stakeholder, their cooperation amplifies the effect. One brings military mass. The other brings patience and capital. Together, they challenge the assumption that the Arctic will remain a low-tension zone. For the United States, this reinforces a strategic imperative: deny rivals uncontested access to critical nodes. For Europe, it creates a dilemma. Either step forward as a coherent security actor or watch decisions about its neighborhood be made elsewhere. Global power today is less about conquest than coordination. Whoever shapes standards, infrastructure, and presence sets the rules others must live with. Greenland sits at the intersection of these forces, and how Europe handles it will signal far beyond the Arctic about whether it intends to be a rule taker or a rule shaper in the emerging order. The future now hinges on choices not yet made. The future of Greenland does not collapse into a single outcome. It branches. The first path is the best one. Europe treats Greenland as strategic core, not peripheral terrain. Presence deepens, integration accelerates, capabilities become visible and sustained. In this scenario, coercion fades not because it is illegal, but because it is pointless. Strength clarifies intent. Cooperation replaces fixation. The second path is familiar. Europe does just enough. More statements, some investment, limited deployments. The system holds, but only barely. Washington remains dominant. Rivals keep probing. Stability exists, but it is fragile, dependent on alignment that may not last. The third path is the most dangerous. Delay continues. Fragmentation persists. Strategic ambiguity hardens into reality. Others fill the space quietly, incrementally, until leverage shifts. At that point, choices narrow fast. And Europe discovers that influence, once lost, is expensive to recover. These are not predictions. They are system outcomes. Strategy is not about intention. It is about follow-through. Greenland will reflect the Europe that chooses it or avoids it. And that brings us to the final question. Greenland is not for sale, but security is never guaranteed by declarations alone. The lesson here is not about American overreach or Russian ambition or Chinese patience, though all three matter. The deeper lesson is about responsibility. Power fills space. When it does, it follows capability, not principle. Europe faces a choice. It can no longer defer. It can continue to rely on rules, assuming others will respect what it does not actively defend. Or it can build a strategic reality so solid that coercion never becomes a credible thought by anyone. That is what real sovereignty looks like in the 21st century. Not isolation, not protest, but presence, integration, commitment over time. If Europe treats Greenland as an awkward problem, it will remain vulnerable. If it treats it as central to its own future, it reshapes the game for Washington, for Moscow, for Beijing. The Arctic is no longer distant. It is decisive. If this analysis helped you see power more clearly, share it. If you want to understand how today's quiet choices shape tomorrow's world, stay with me. Because the next story will not be about Greenland. It will be about what comes after Europe decides who it really is.